From a number of ignorant and insensitive comments to his extreme bias as an announcer, these are the times UFC fans got angry at Joe Rogan. Rogan has practically become the voice of the UFC, covering thousands of fights since he first joined in 1997. But did you know Rogan made some pretty off-color remarks when a fighter had heart failure inside the octagon? Known for commentating UFC fights and hosting his own podcast, Joe Rogan has been no stranger to controversy. Back in 2016, Data 5000 Harris faced the infamous Kimbo Slice. Harris came out looking sluggish and lacking the stamina required to go toe-to-toe with such a lethal opponent. What started as one of the worst fights in recent years quickly turned into one of the scariest moments in MMA history. The contest was stopped as Data was rushed to the local hospital, where it was announced that he suffered from heart failure. Yeah, even in a fight where Kimbo and Data danced around like amateurs, Slice damn near killed his opponent. Harris was improperly conditioned for the bout and nowhere near fighting shape. On an episode of Rogan's podcast, he shared his take on the Data versus Kimbo incident. Joe said, yeah, his heart stopped. It was filled with cheeseburgers, fried chicken, and orange soda. His extremely inconsiderate comments infuriated UFC fans, who blasted Rogan for his appalling racism. Data was still in the friggin' hospital at the time of Rogan's boorish remarks. The Harris family soon issued a public response saying, mocking Data 5000 with hurtful and racist comments is despicable and divisive and has no place in the sport of mixed martial arts. UFC fans headed to Twitter to share their disgust. It's surprising Joe didn't get outright canceled. But as you'll soon discover, Joe seemingly gets away with a whole lot more than his racist comments on Data Harris. Rogan invited UFC president Dana White to his podcast, where the color commentator made a crude joke about UFC star Chris Justino's gender. Justino is named Cyborg for her machine-like precision and power in the octagon. One of Rogan's guests on the show jokingly discussed fighting against Cyborg. He asked, I wouldn't even know where to begin. Where would I start? Where Rogan responded, her dick. Oof. Soon after the podcast episode aired, the UFC community chimed in with their disapproval. Fans were furious at the callous nature of Joe's joke and implored him to apologize. Cyborg was pissed off and accused Rogan and his guests of bullying her. Justino was upset at the way Joe was using his platform, especially when he's got the UFC president on the show. Although he accepted responsibility and issued an apology, Cyborg headed to Facebook to let her fans know what was up. She said, it opens the door for fans and other people in the sport to make similar comments because they see the example and think it's acceptable. Long story short, Rogan was yet again in hot water for his despicable comments on Justino's gender. Do you remember how good Ronda Rousey was? Well, during a post-match interview, her dominant first-round knockout brought Rogan to tears. During a UFC 190 shutdown, Rousey knocked out her opponent, Bet Correa, in just 35 seconds. Fans headed to Twitter to call out Rogan for his crocodile tears. He was seen choking on words, holding back his tears, while delivering a heap of praise to Ronda Rousey. Yet fans felt something strange was up. His words didn't come across as genuine, but instead felt more like a staged marketing ploy. You gotta remember, Rousey was the first insanely popular female UFC fighter. She was heavily included in advertising the sport, and Dana White wasn't afraid to admit it. Following the interview, Joe tweeted, "That was the first time I ever almost cried while interviewing a fighter. At Ronda Rousey is something insanely special." Despite his attempts to double down on his admiration for Rousey, fans let Rogan know they saw through his crap. The next morning, he said, "I woke up to a parade of tweets calling me a bitch for almost crying during the At Ronda Rousey interview last night." While he's known for oozing passion and love for the sport, fans joined in, calling out the phony announcer. Fast forward a few years, and Ronda Rousey was a mere shadow of her former self. She had lost several fights and her status as the GOAT of the female UFC. After previously touting Rousey as a once-in-a-lifetime athlete, Rogan blasted her after getting knocked out by Holly Holm. Rousey was talking some serious smack heading into UFC 193 and was expected to dominate Holly Holm. Just days after her brutal defeat, Rogan shared his take on an episode of his podcast saying, That's what happens when you get so absorbed with this idea that you're special. Seems pretty ironic, considering he was fighting back the waterworks when praising Rousey himself. Rogan continued claiming, "This game doesn't give a about your charisma, how many times you've been on Entourage." The man's a freaking savage. He not only called out her diminishing fighting skills, but downright bullied Rousey, which doesn't really add up, especially since Rogan was one of her earliest and most devoted supporters. Just a year later, Rousey refused a post-fight interview with Rogan, storming off and quickly fleeing the octagon. Fans were fed up with Rogan yet again. They reminded the color commentator he'd never stand a chance in the octagon and has no actual experience as a fighter. Despite her decline from the world's best, UFC Twitter defended Rousey's honor. Supporters slammed Rogan for building a reputation as the jackass of the sport. Moving on, let's take a look at Rogan's insanely biased commentary. Rogan has been transparent with his favoritism, building a reputation as an unfair announcer. The UFC community was in uproar after Rogan flip-flopped his support at UFC 287. Israel Adesanya faced his bitter rival, Alex Pereira, in a championship rematch fight. Rogan is a longtime supporter of Pereira, constantly commending the Brazilian star for seamlessly transitioning to the UFC. Rogan has even said Pereira is truly one of the most terrifying human beings alive. Prior to Pereira's rematch bout with Adesanya, the color commentator gushed about the Brazilian kickboxer. Throughout the first 2 rounds of the fight, Rogan wouldn't shut up about his admiration for Pereira. Several fans tweeted, "Suck already, Joe," in frustration of the extreme bias. The Brazilian dominated the contest, and the Rogan favoritism was coming through clear as day. Until Adesanya knocked out Pereira in the second round of the fight. Joe claimed the KO was the best he'd ever seen, and instantly switched his allegiance in the post-fight interview. He showered Adesanya with compliments, causing fans to give their take on Joe's undeniable bias. One fan tweeted, "Rogan is such a prisoner of the moment, everything is the best to him." Fans were extremely confused, as Rogan's bias toward Pereira was abundantly clear in the fight. But when Adesanya knocked him out, the tides quickly turned. Fans were livid with Joe for his clear favoritism towards Pereira, but his commentary bias has a long history, dating way back to his early days in the UFC. Rogan always had a list of his favorite fighters. Back in 2012, Quentin "Rampage" Jackson called out Rogan's obvious bias. Prior to his huge matchup at UFC 144, Rampage said he's, Rogan, so biased towards jiu-jitsu guys, pointing to Rogan's list of favorite fighters. During his first tenure as an announcer, Joe did a very poor job of hiding his allegiances. BJ Penn was clearly one of his most cherished fighters since he had a background in jiu-jitsu and was besties with Rogan. Another close friend of his was Lyoto Machida. Fans were pissed when Machida fought Mauricio Rua, as Rogan gushed about his buddy for the entire fight. He came under some serious scrutiny since he practically ignored Rua's presence in the contest. It's not always Joe's biased comments that anger UFC supporters, but rather what he doesn't say. Die-hard fans of the sport have witnessed Rogan's bias for far too long and have demanded a change in his ways. So, from his extreme bias as an announcer to a number of ignorant and insensitive comments, those were the times UFC fans got angry at Joe Rogan.